This talk is more about modeling and ideas and less about examples and pictures. So I had to make some decisions when I was going through it, and I guess that's what I came up with. And as usual, I have more material than I will have time for, but we'll do the best we can. So the title essentially covers sort of what I've been doing for more than the last 20 years. Basically working a lot with spatial modeling and trying to put a formal foundation on a lot of sort of spatial problems that people have generally in the past kind of relegated to a lot of GIS sort of software without necessarily trying to put formal inference on them. And putting a formal inference engine on all of this kind of puts you in the world of hierarchical modeling, and so that seemed to be a natural place to wind up. The environmental challenges, again, came from primarily connecting with people who work a lot with species distribution models and ecologists in general, and the environmental challenges came again from working with people at the Environmental Protection Agency and building some bridges there. And so those are the two main themes that I'm going to try to say something about today. So this is, again, as I said, a lot about ideas, and I had to make some decisions, if you will, in order to somehow or other put together what could reasonably be an hour's worth of material. And so these are, again, two subject areas that I'll spend some time on. So we'll try to give a big picture first, and it's a little daunting, actually, to realize there are two other rooms watching this, and I have no idea who's there and how many people are there. But I hope you're okay. In any event, okay, so modeling species distributions is a long-standing problem in ecology. It's been studied for possibly as long as 100 years at this point, and I'm going to focus only on a small portion of it, which is basically presence-absence data and presence-only data. And presence-absence data is sort of what's geostatistical for me. In other words, we observe random binary responses at a set of fixed locations. And the question is modeling species individually or modeling species jointly. And again, this is sort of the theme that I'll play my way through. However, there's another strand of sampling, which is what we call presence-only sampling, where you wander around, and if you happen to see something, you record what you saw and where you saw it. And so in some sense, it's like watching a point pattern. And so that takes us to a different kind of problem. And what I'm particularly concerned about is that the literature has handled this badly. Historically, they've kind of ignored the fact that these are two completely different sampling paradigms, and fusing them or suggesting one platform works for both is not really a good way to do things, and that's what I'm going to try to argue. And it all comes down to trying to define what a presence means. So I'll tell you a lot about that. All right, the second problem is this business about environmental exposure. And again, I don't think I have to say too much about the fact that there's always strong interest in the environmental contaminants that we are exposed to and their connections to adverse health outcomes. And so again, this becomes an important problem. And again, in this situation, I can start with a basic geostatistical model and build from there. And we can look at simple versions of single pollutants and go to joint pollutants and go to component of pollutants and go to fusing different data sources. And again, there's just a rich range of opportunities there. And I'd like to tell you part of that story as well. So those are the two themes, and we'll spend about an hour on each one. Probably not, but some version of that. We'll do the best we can. All right, so as I said, two different data types. The sort of the presence-absence version kind of imagines design sampling. How well designed is not that clear often, but it is the case that individuals go to some designed locations and sample presence, absence of a species. Maybe they sample even more, like abundance, and they might even measure characteristics of some of the individuals there. It's a question of the nature of the data collection, but in any event, that's sort of the version of it. How designed it is, again, it is sort of well known that ecologists sample where they're going to find something. There's no reason to go somewhere where there's not going to be anything to see, but obviously that introduces bias, therefore, into where you're going to find presence and absence. So that's part of a concern, of course. Presence-only data is something that's also becoming more popular because it's kind of a component of what we call citizen science, I guess, where more and more people will just sort of trek through different areas and record what they see. And here I'm going to focus on plants, but there are a lot of people who are birders who do this sort of thing, and people who study animal movement and such. Again, different opportunities to encounter in this fashion at random locations. Okay? And again, one of the challenges that happens in the literature is because people are not clear on exactly what a presence is, the two types of data sometimes get confused, and presence is somehow viewed sometimes as the same thing as presence. Presence absence almost the same thing as presence only. So we'll find out a little bit more about this as we go through it. All right, so I guess the question of what is a presence-absence event is really at the heart of everything here. And I know from experience, having spent time with lots of different ecologists, asking them what a presence-absence event means is you get lots of different answers. And that's because a lot of ecologists, of course, don't think about things in a sort of foundational way, the way we are encouraged to do. They don't think in terms of what it takes maybe to build probabilistic models. Again, why should they? Maybe it's not part of their canon of knowledge, and so as a result, what it leads to, again, is challenges because from my perspective, I would like to envision a coherent definition of what a presence-absence event is, and I'd like to imagine it to be generative in a sense, that I'd like to be able to imagine that my presence-absence conception could actually generate the data that I'm observing. I'm really uncomfortable with kind of kludging together different pieces and somehow or other calling it a model. I would like a model that could, as I said, actually have generated the data I'm observing. Okay, maybe it's a severe simplification of the process I'm interested in, but it should at least be generative, at least in my mind, in some sense. As I said, I'm going to focus on plants, and so from my perspective, if I want to look at any location in the region, I can only see a 0 or a 1 there, a presence or an absence, and so my view of what presence-absence looks like over a region is essentially a binary map. It's just a map where at every location there's either a 0 or a 1. Okay? That doesn't seem so difficult to accept. It's amazing how much resistance you can find. But here's the challenge then. This surface cannot be imagined through aerial units. And the reason, of course, is that once you select aerial units, that determines ones and zeros in a fashion that depends upon those units. It depends on the size, the shape, the orientation of those units. So it can't really make any sense to do that. It's done routinely. What can I say? It certainly disagrees with how presence-absence arises in nature. It seems to me to insist that presence-absence has to be viewed at point level. So that's my foundational point here. And of course, if you start with a point level definition, you can always scale up. You cannot necessarily do the reverse. And so that's, again, that's the case that I'm going to try to make here. And so again, from a point level perspective, we can sort of see the realization. We don't have to impose any scales of any sort. We can even attempt to clarify the behavior that we expect for this presence-absence surface, et cetera. And again, the challenge you find in the literature is presence-absence is often referred to at, as I said, plot level in some fashion, grid cells, quadrats, something of that nature. And again, it's exacerbated by scaling, depending upon the size of your grid cells compared with the size of your study region. they could start to look like points to you. And so, again, you can see where some confusion can come in all of this. But I would say that, of course, formally, presence-absence is never actually observed at a point. It can never be unitless, right? You can never be unitless. You can always have a point that has some physical area to it. And the same thing is when you take a temperature measurement. You never get a temperature measurement at a point. You get a temperature measurement that's associated with some area. It's up to the, accuracy of your measurement scale by which you record the physical location where you collected the measurement. And the same thing is true with points here. Of course, that doesn't prevent us from building point-level models. We've been building point-level models for the history of our field, and so there's no reason why we should worry about that issue in terms of specifying point-level models. Okay, so again, everything here I'm just repeating. Maybe the one point that's worth saying a bit about is over here where I think this is another issue that results from looking at presence-absence at an areal scale, and that is if you have two regions with the same area, but in one region you found 10 individuals, in the other region you found 1 individual, shouldn't that have some implications in terms of modeling the probability of presence for that unit? Okay, so a lot of the modeling doesn't seem to care. Anyway, if we turn to presence only, which is again the other side of this business, now again, we would certainly have to concede that for any particular finite bounded region that we would look at, the number of individuals has to be finite. Okay? We'll assume it has to be finite. And so therefore, if you wanted to look at it in that fashion, then what we really have is a point pattern of individuals over the study region. Okay? And it can be a lot of individuals, it can be few, depends upon whether we're looking at trees or whether we're looking at small individuals. So I'm not quantifying how big is finite, but all I'm saying is some sort of point pattern is there. And so if we want to connect what's actually going on in nature, which is a point pattern of presences, with a realization of a presence-absence surface, which is a binary map, we have to be careful in terms of making the definitions. The troubling thing for me is that if you then asked an ecologist who went out to sample presence-absence, would that ecologist ever think of modeling presence-absence as a point pattern? And the answer is, of course not. The ecologist would have gone just to a few sites, would not have collected points at random. The ecologist would have no idea how to build a point pattern model for the data that she or he collected. There'd be no way to actually imagine doing that. So, it's not sensible, and yet that's what some people are claiming is an appropriate thing to do. What's really appropriate, of course, would be to build a regression model, in particular in regression models at point level. And so again, that's what I'm going to argue for. So again, probabilistically, we can imagine a Bernoulli trial at every location. And so what we need is a probability of presence surface over locations, over the region. And so there's sort of two surfaces here. There's this probability of presence surface of probabilities, and we can model it to have behaviors that we wish. And then there's the actual realized surface of presence-absence, which is this binary map that I've already talked about. Okay, and so in any event, there's no notion of intensity associated with this. There's no notion of point pattern associated with this, and so we have to watch out in terms of what we're trying to do here. Okay, we can scale again point pattern. We can scale presence-absence at individual locations to areal units. All we have to do is average the realization over the unit, and so it's like the proportion of ones over the region is, for example, the prevalence of the species over the region, and just in general, the proportion of individuals in a unit is sort of the empirical chance of finding an individual in that unit. We model probabilities for that unit. The average over the unit is going to be the average probability over that unit. And again, that's going to be just the chance of randomly selecting an individual in the location in that unit and seeing an individual there. Okay, so it all comes together in a coherent sort of fashion. And the idea then is if we're going to go back to working at point level, then we need to build point level models. And so a natural thing to do is build these binary regression models using logit links or probit links. And so that's, again, there's a fair bit of literature. Some of the literature use these GAMs, generalized additive models, to do this modeling. There was a big push on this for a while about turn of the century, and people like them because of the flexibility. However, it was pretty soon realized that what they tend to do is they tend to overfit and they have terrible out-of-sample prediction. And so GAMs, fortunately, have fallen into disfavor, which is certainly fine with me. In any event, much of this work is done on Spatial, as it says here. And I would certainly argue that we'd anticipate spatial dependence in the sense of the usual omitted or unobserved regressors. And the idea of bringing in dependence structure is really useful because it enables us to infer about presence-absence where we have not sampled. In other words, in many situations, we only, as I said, go to a designed set of locations, but you'd like to say something about presence-absence over the whole region. And if you have an underlying process model that's driving presence-absence, then you'll be able to do that sort of thing. And so therefore, you can accommodate gaps in sampling, or you can accommodate, as it says, a regular sampling effort. And so there's clearly some benefit to doing that. Start with the simplest imaginable model. And so we have essentially just a Bernoulli trial, and if we, at any location, and if we observe a set of locations within a particular grid cell, we could model the locations, say in that grid cell as binomial over the number of points in that grid cell, and maybe put a logit or probit model on it and have something really simple. So for example, this is what it might actually look like. So maybe we grid it up. This happens to be the Cape Floristic region in South Africa that some of you, I'm sure, have heard me talk about before. But in any event, what we're looking at is simply gridding up a subregion. And in this subregion, you can sort of see what the aerial grid looks like, and you can see what some of the points in that region might look like. And so this is simply an illustration of what I'm kind of describing in terms of maybe some simple binomial model. All right? We could go do this actually at point level modeling. To work at point level modeling, specifically with point level covariates, would be fine. Often we only get point level predictors at aerial scales, and so if we have point level predictors at aerial scale, we just wind up back with the previous model, so there's not much to say. If we wanted to go spatially explicit, then we could now, say at aerial scale, at grid cell scale, we could add these random effects, the usual spatial random effects at aerial scale. And so these random effects can then be modeled as sort of aerial unit random effects. And so that takes us to the wonderful world of Markov random fields and conditionally autoregressive models. And so that would be an opportunity to do something in that regard. On the other hand, if you wanted to insist on working at point level, which would be my preference again, then rather than putting a car model in at point level, we'd probably introduce a Gaussian process at the second stage. That omega s there is a spatial random effect, and it will encourage certain behaviors in terms of the realization of this PS surface. Okay, and so again, I have to emphasize there are two surfaces at stake here. One would be to infer about this PS surface, probably a presence surface, and the other would be to predict, in some sense, the realized presence-absence surface at locations of interest. Okay, so I'm repeating myself a little bit, but trying to sell my story perhaps as well as I can. You can even build a hierarchical version of this. The reason for building a hierarchical version of this is because often when we sample, locations have been transformed. Ecologists refer to it as trashing, but in any event, it's usually due to human intervention, anthropogenic effects, we often call them. And so the result is that we've wound up with some units that cannot have a species there simply because they're unavailable, because they've been transformed to a parking lot, or some even agricultural utilization. So as a result, we can think about potential presence absence, and we can model potential presence absence, and then we can think about transformed according to availability. So I'm thinking about a picture that looks something like this, where we have a transformation of the landscape. And so therefore you build a multi-level sort of version where you can have, again, sort of the potential, and you can have the transformed presence, and you can kind of scale it down to a data level model as you wish. And I won't get into detail on this at all, but I would simply say that, again, therefore, the potential presence model is simply describing suitability of that location, whereas the transformed version is specifying suitability and availability. Okay, and for example, here's a recovery of a species for that particular region that I just showed you before, and on the left you see the potential for that species to be over the region, and you can see places where the probability is pretty high, but the species is not there. On the other hand, of course, if you move to the center panel, you can see where now we dealt with the transformation landscape, and so the center panel produces a probability of presence surface that more resembles the data. Okay, so there's useful information here, I think, in terms of potentially where species might be found. Okay, I'm going to move to multivariate species modeling for just a couple minutes here, and in this particular context, I'd like to sort of talk about two specification perspectives which often get lost in the literature. Even in the Bayesian community, I think people sometimes misinterpret these. And so the first situation is what I'll call a second stage model, introducing a latent surface at the second stage. And that is the probability of presence is modeled through a Gaussian process. And so in particular, for example, if I have a Gaussian process that looks like this, then the probability of presence is the probability this guy is bigger than 0. And so that just takes a form that looks something like this. And if you think about it in this particular situation, then you realize that what this means is the YS's are conditionally independent Bernoulli trials given the probability of presence. I don't know if that's a good model. I don't like it very much. The reason I don't like it very much is because I don't think that's the way you will realize a presence-absence surface in the real world. A presence-absence surface should be locally smooth in some fashion, should be locally continuous. If, where a species is at a point, it should be, therefore it points close to it. On the other hand, if you have conditionally independent presence-absence surface, then it's a bit like a checkerboard. It can be 0, 1 anywhere according to the result of a Bernoulli trial at that location, and that seems less real. So I'm a little bit concerned about that, which is why I prefer maybe the second choice, where we simply model YS as an indicator of whether ZS is bigger than 0. Rather than modeling YS given ZS, we're modeling YS as a function of ZS. So if YS is a function of ZS, now if the ZS surface is a realization of a smooth Gaussian process, then the YS surface will inherit some smoothness from it as well. And so as a result, there's some benefit to this. So there's some discussion of this in the literature. Jim Clark, who I work with a lot at Duke, has spent a lot of time on the first version of things, directly modeling the dependence at the first stage. Otto Ovaskainen, who was at the last meeting here we had, prefers to do it at the second stage. And so it's not a matter of a serious argument, but it's a matter of where you want to try to specify the dependence at the first stage or at the second stage. So that takes me quickly to joint species distribution models, and the idea here again is that historically these species distribution models have been considered individually, model each individual species, and then if you would like to look at joint performance, you just stack them up. You just stack them up over any particular location. And you can imagine the problems with that. I mean, you're failing to recognize that there is interaction between species. And if you fail to capture that, then what happens is, for one thing, you tend to overpredict. You tend to predict too many individuals because you don't have that sort of negative pushback between species that will discourage maybe fewer species at a location. In particular, you can imagine it if I build independent models for 1,000 species and I go to a particular location. Am I going to predict maybe half a dozen species being there? The answer is probably not, and yet at most locations that's what you're going to find is only a few species. You're not going to find 500 species at a location, and so you can immediately imagine the difficulty. And it also leads to other misleading findings, for example, in terms of significance of regression coefficients, things of that sort. So it's much better to imagine things done jointly, but the question to do things jointly is challenging because to capture dependence is different from formal specification of interaction. Modeling interaction, between species is not an easy thing to do. Modeling dependence in terms of presence of species is a much easier thing to do, and so that's what's happened in the literature is we have modeled dependence between species rather than formal specifications of interactions. Okay, and so the world has grown rapidly in this regard, and now we have versions of joint species distributions to handle a wide range of data, presence, absence, continuous discrete abundance, abundance with a large number of zeros, compositional data, all sorts of things are available. What's the challenge with joint species distribution modeling? Well, you can see it in the simplest version. If I have S species and each one could be present or absent at a location, then I have a contingency table with 2 to the S cells in it. And with 1,000 species, or even 500 species, or even 100 species, who can build a sensible model for 2 to the 100 cells? The answer is you cannot. And if we now add spatial dependence to this by looking at sites over a region and expecting presence absence to be dependent across sites, the obvious answer is that this is not a way that we can actually address this problem. And so the solution that appears in the literature, as you'd expect, is to put in latent S-dimensional multivariate normal models. And so that's essentially what we wind up doing. And it's become a very active area for Bayesians recently. And again, as I mentioned, Jim Clark does work with independent latent multivariate normals at each site. Daniel Taylor Rodriguez and a group I was involved with, we did a dimension reduction in order to handle, for example, 1,000 species. We introduced essentially a tall and skinny matrix to get a dimension reduction and used latent Dirichlet processes to introduce clustering. And so we were able to do something like that. Otso Hovaskainen, as I mentioned, does a second stage approach, again with independent multivariate normals. Shin Shirota, who's here, a former student of mine, and I extended with Sudipto some of this work to include spatial dependence, again with dimension reduction. So again, we do have ways of now addressing this, and they seem to validate pretty well. I want to turn a little bit back to what does the probability of presence mean. I'm going to be here forever. It looks like this is not good. I just have too much material. But anyway, I would like to get to the second problem. Well, we keep going. So again, I'm not going to repeat all the words that I said here, but I just want to clarify again formally in some sense that if we build a presence-absence model at point level, then we know exactly what the event ys equals 1 means. What does the event ya mean? And so again, a coherent definition is to use it as a block average of the process. In other words, just to average the process, which is a binary surface over the unit that you're interested in. And you can clearly see, therefore, that ya is not a Bernoulli trial. In fact, that probably y equals 1 is equal to 0. So it clearly points out that there's a difference between thinking about things in this regard versus thinking about things in terms of point patterns. In terms of point patterns, again, if we take a region of, say, A, and we look at the number of individuals in A, now the probability of presence in A is just the probability of at least one individual in A. And if we use something, even basic like a non-homogeneous Poisson process or a log Gaussian Cox process, in any event, we would just integrate the intensity over A, and we would wind up with a Poisson variable over A. And therefore, the probability that YA equals 1 is exactly that expression that appears over here. And you can clearly see this has nothing to do with the previous definition. In fact, you can see they're completely incompatible. In fact, it's worse than that. This definition depends clearly on the size of A. You can't avoid the size of A. And it has to be distorted by the number of individuals you observe in A, and it has nothing to do with the previous version of things. And they're just two incompatible definitions of the probability of presence. And again, this fundamental difference has been completely ignored in the literature. It's just been completely ignored. And again, it's because of two completely different conceptualizations. As I keep repeating, the first one is we're not sampling a point pattern. We go to a set of locations in the region and we see what's there. The second one imagines that there's a potential point pattern over the region, and a partially observed portion of that point pattern is what we actually get to see because it has to be degraded. We almost never sample all the individuals over a region. Okay? And so again, a lot of what's in the slide is repetitious, and so it seems clear again that we need to make two different definitions in this regard. In fact, it becomes even more serious if you try to fuse data types. For example, if you have two different regions and one experiment has generated some presence-absence data, another experiment has generated presence-only data, how do you do the fusion? The usual fusion strategy is to introduce kind of a latent model and say both of my data sets inform about that latent model. And you cannot do that here. You cannot do that here because the generating mechanisms, the probability mechanisms, are completely different. And to do a fusion in this situation requires a completely different strategy. And it's called shared process modeling. And I'll show you that in one slide in just a bit. But anyway, so that's the challenge. Just to talk about presence-only data a little bit, since I focus more on the presence-absence data so far. Again, this is becoming more common. There is some feeling in the community that presence-absence data is better than presence-only data. In fact, that's not true, I don't think. It's not clear that presence-only data is inferior. In fact, in principle, if you had a complete census of individuals through presence only, you would know everything. You'd know more than you'd get from a presence-absence data collection. So it's clearly not the case that it's inferior. It's just different, as I keep saying. And of course, the challenge is that a complete census of individuals is almost never achieved. It's usually too expensive. It exceeds time and financial resources to be able to implement it. Okay? What not to do, again, you can imagine there's a lot of stuff in the literature about dealing with presence-only data. In the earlier days only meaning turn of this century, people used to introduce background samples using known environmental characteristics and call them pseudo-absences. Why? Well, I don't know. They didn't know. Nobody ever went there, but they called them pseudo-absences. All right, and then they built logistic regressions using these pseudo-absences with the observed presences and tried to build logistic regressions. How dumb is that? Think about it. You never observed an absence. You only observed presences. How could you possibly model the probability of presence? You know, everybody in this room would know that's stupid. I better not say more. I'll get into trouble. In any event, the worst thing about this approach is it manufactures data. How many pseudo-absences is good? 5? 1,000? Where does this come from? How rectal can you be? You know, it's absurd to follow this path. But nonetheless, it was popular for a while. The strategy now that seems to be popular in the literature is a max-n strategy, which is an optimization, a constrained optimization approach. And it's, again, one of these things where there's a convenient software package, and if you build it, they will come, is the philosophy that it's followed. And so people use it. It's actually not of interest here since it's not really model-based. Okay? And so again, we're going to agree that we need to build a formal point pattern model. like spatial random effects, and as a result introduce a Cox process. And so that seems to be the natural way to deal with it. But of course, there are going to be challenges when you deal with this because of the fact that the pattern that you see is biased through these anthropogenic processes, as I mentioned, transformation of the landscape, a very irregular sampling effort. In other words, when people go out and collect presence-only data, again, they go where it's interesting. They go to a park, or maybe they go to some attractive rural piece of land, but they may not go everywhere. Some of the land is privately owned. Some of the land is just not easily accessible. So as a result, we know there's bias in the sampling as well. There's even the possibility of misdetection or misclassification in terms of, again, the point pattern that you're actually seeing. And so we need to kind of imagine a potential intensity versus a realized intensity, and we have to treat the realized intensity as a degradation, if you will, of the potential intensity. So anyway, that's where this goes. And so as a result, a model that Abhishek Chakraborty and I played with for a while looks something like this, where we have a kind of a standard Cox process model for the potential intensity, and then the degradation occurs like we showed before according to availability of the landscape. And so we can have a product form which can be 0 or lambda s according to availability or not, and then we can add binary sampling effort to this and put together something that looks like this. And all together we come up with a degraded intensity. And it has lots of nice features, and I'm not going to say too much more about it, but I was going to only show you for a few different species here. On the left is a potential intensity surface over the Cape Floristic region. On the right is the realized intensity, which is obviously lower intensity surface if you just look at them for these 3 species. And here's 3 more species that you might stare at for a second. Okay, one last slide on this, and then we move on to the second problem. So I'm not in terrible shape. There is a role for preferential sampling in all of this, and we owe Peter Diggle some props for introducing that into the literature. And there's a lovely paper by Debbie Patti and Brian Rich and Dave Dunson that I think showed really one of the most attractive ways for looking at preferential sampling. And so this business here is that exactly what that second bullet says. If you only sample places where you expect to find high levels of, say, pollution, then when you interpolate, you can only find high levels from the interpolation because you're only seeing high points, and therefore you're only going to average in some spatial sense to see high values. And so if you don't actually sample without bias, then you can imagine there'll be bias in your inference about the spatial surface you're trying to learn about, say an environmental exposure surface. So that's the challenge. And for us, it arises with ecology in this presence-absence business is, again, is there bias in the presence-absence surface? In other words, is it the case that ecologists go where they expect to find things? And if so, then there's bias in terms of seeing more ones than you would see if you chose locations in a more uniform way over your study region. And so preferential sampling is a way to improve the presence-absence surface. It also offers a probabilistically coherent way to fuse presence-absence and presence-only data using shared process models, which are at the core of the preferential sampling ideas from Diggle and from Patti. And Shin is going to give a talk on that here on Thursday at 5:30, 17:30, right? So if you'd like to learn more about that, he will give you a half hour of it. Okay, so the second half of the talk is environmental exposure, and I'll do the best I can. Fortunately, it's a little shorter than the first half, and probably that's merciful for everybody. But this is, again, the basic geostatistical model, so I don't think I need to spend much time on that. Everybody recognizes that what we do here is we introduce a mean, and then we introduce 2 components in the residual. One is a spatially structured component, and the other is a pure error component. And we usually assume that the spatially structured component is a realization of a mean zero Gaussian process. And we put this together, and it's a univariate process model. Okay? And again, I've written a lot about this. Lots of people have written lots about this. And so I don't think we need to say too much about this. Again, we know the interpretation of the pure error component, either in terms of measurement error or in terms of noise and replication of measurement or as microscale variability. Lots of things you can say about what that might actually be. All right? We would often be interested in a multivariate process model. And the multivariate process model simply reflects the fact that at two different locations, at a rather particular location, we might observe more than a single contaminant. For example, ozone, nitrogen oxide, carbon monoxide, particulate matter, small particulate or fine particulate matter. All sorts of things are possible. And so there are different contexts in which we look at multivariate spatial data. And with multivariate spatial data, we have sort of two then component ideas in terms of dependence. One is within location, and one is across locations. And so in order to proceed with this, what we need to do is build a cross-covariance matrix. And again, I apologize if this is too familiar for everybody, but what we really need to do is determine the pairwise dependence structure between each component at location S and each component at location S prime. And so with P dimensional vectors, we need a P by P matrix whose entries are as indicated there. And the way we tend to work with this is essentially we take a bivariate Gaussian process or generally a multivariate Gaussian process in this situation, p-variate Gaussian process, and we just overlay this cross-covariance structure on top of it. And so that's how we build a valid process. In fact, we do it even more simply than that, and that is we use the so-called linear model of co-regionalization, which says that one of the easiest ways to imagine building a dependent p-variate process is to make a linear transformation of p-independent processes. What could be easier? What could be more natural? And so that's what we do. It's certainly computationally easier. It's certainly valid in terms of creating a valid cross-covariance function. You know, if you start with stationary processes, you'll wind up with stationary processes under linear transformation. And so basically your A matrix becomes the parameters in the model, and you can extract a general cross-covariance structure that looks something like this. And again, we use it usually as a random effect specification. Okay? It often requires a lot of parameters. If we have p entries, we have order p squared parameters. We can often take A to be lower triangular, but it's still order p squared parameters. And so sometimes what we do is we make A tall and skinny. So essentially, we wind up with a dimension reduction from, say, P processes to R processes. And so, again, a lot of you are familiar with this sort of thing. This is you know, a typical dimension reduction strategy. There are other constructions in the literature. Kernel convolution is one, for example, and there are lots of others at this point. But co-regionalization is quite easy at this point to work with. If we go to space and time, then all we're going to do is add a second argument. Of course, it depends on whether time is viewed as discrete or continuous. I'm tending to think of it as continuous here, and in any event, we will have local covariates in space and time, a local mean structure. The question about the coefficients is interesting. Should we have space-time varying coefficients? Should we have just temporal coefficients or spatially varying coefficients? Perhaps just a constant set of coefficients? These are modeling things that one can play with in terms of looking at these structures. Okay, so if we want to now go to the world of data fusion in this regard, then Bayesian melding is sort of arguably the most elegant version of doing this. Unfortunately, it's too computationally demanding. I'll make it clear on the next slide why it's not feasible to do it the way you'd want to do it. But intuitively, it sounds really attractive in the sense that, for example, if you have a true underlying process, and say you have measurements from monitoring stations that vary around the true process, and then maybe you have some numerical model output over a grid, which also informs about the process, then you'd like to use these two data processes to infer about the true underlying process. And so basically that's what data fusion idea is all about. And here's a little bit of technical detail on it, but pretty simple in the sense that the standard measurement error model applies for the monitoring station data, and we build something resembling a calibration model, a spatially varying slope and a spatially varying intercept and a spatially varying slope. And we can model this as possibly a trend surface. We can model this in different ways. Usually it's not very well identified if we keep it spatially varying as a slope. But in any event, you can put this together. And then the basic pure error, the basic truth is, again, modeled in some fashion with a mean structure and a Gaussian process. So this is the idea. And why is this a problem to deal with? The problem occurs right here. The problem occurs right here. I think I have it on the next slide a little more clearly. No, I don't. Sorry. The problem occurs over here, and that is where you have to do all this averaging. You have to do the averaging of Z star B, which means you have to average this. And if you have to average this, that means all of your integrals are stochastic integrals, because all of your integrals are integrals over the true spatial surface. And so that makes life a little difficult. So that's why we got into downscaling as an alternative way of addressing this problem. Again, it's fusion from a different perspective. It recognizes that we want to use the numerical models because they give measurements at all locations, but not well calibrated. And we want to use monitoring station data, which gives much more accurate measurements, but only more sparsely available. And so we tend to build models that downscale. And I was going to show just a simple illustration of two data sources. The NAM SLAMS data in the US, which is an EPA database that works at point level monitoring. And then there's essentially a numerical model, meteorological model that provides aerial data. And so without getting into too much detail, since Sudipto is already threatening me with the hook, we wind up building models that are essentially something that looks like this, where we use the computer model output as a regressor to help adjust the true, to find the truth with spatially varying intercept and spatially varying slope. They work pretty well, and again, we've got lots of illustrations of how to do this, and lots of examples of where, how well it does. And for example, in this situation, the bottom image is the downscaler, and I think it, again, out of context, it's not going to mean very much to you, but out of sample prediction works extremely well with these guys. We can make it dynamic. And again, in the interest of time, I'm not going to spend much effort on this. And dynamic can be in two different fashions. We can have dynamically evolving coefficients in this fashion, or we could just have independent processes for the coefficients. Lots of things can be done. We can do joint modeling with the downscaler. We can put pairs of contaminants together. And what we do is build, therefore, a model that looks, for example, something like this. This model gets interesting because if you count, you'll see quickly that there are 6 processes in this model. And so we have to build a 6-dimensional Gaussian process specification here. And so we build it again in terms of sort of a local adjustment to a global coefficient. It winds up looking something like this under co-regionalization. And you can do lots of interesting things with this model. You can choose that A matrix to introduce different types of dependence between the processes and therefore study essentially the relationships in more detail if you wish. Okay, so I'm going to finish up with something that is work with Colin Rundell, who's here in the audience as well. He apparently gave a very successful short course yesterday, at least that's what we assume. Anyway, components of PM 2.5. This is an area that's gotten some more recent attention because PM 2.5 is a mixture of as much as 20 different components. And it's of interest to figure out whether some of these components have differential adverse health effects. And so it's possibly important to separate them out. And so in this context, we wound up fusing 4 databases. After all, if you could do 2, why not flex our muscles and do 4? And so we have 3 federal databases, plus we have the computer model output. And we looked at 5 primary species, which are the species indicated here, and try to put a model together for all of this. And so it's a bit of a challenge, and it's clear that Colin gave a lot of blood in the process of doing this. But in any event, I think the most important thing to note here is something that troubled us, but didn't seem to trouble the EPA that much. And that's this sort of violation. It's obvious that if we add another category to the 5 species, then the sum of other plus the 5 species has to be the total PM. All right? And the interesting thing is this sum constraint is violated quite a bit. In other words, looking at the sites up here and looking at this figure down here, you can see the percentage of time where the sum of the components, the 5 components, exceeded the total. That's a bit of a problem, isn't it? That's a little hard to model. So what it winds up forcing on us is a latent modeling specification. We do everything on a latent scale, and then we have, essentially measurement error models on top of that. And so that winds up building models that I'm going to have no time to tell you about, but they're nice. Trust me, they're quite all right. Maybe the best thing to do is to show you the hierarchical version of it. There you go. So that's, for example, the hierarchical model that drives all of this, and that doesn't mean anything without looking at the symbols. But it was a very effective way of assessing the components and predicting the components as well. We partitioned the country into 9 regions, and up above you can see the relative amounts of the components and how they vary over time and over space. And so I quit. Thanks.